Congratulations on the film.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm going to begin at the end because it's all fresh in our minds, but very powerful ending. You end it on a very intimate moment. We've experienced a film on an epic scale, yet you chose to end with the family that we followed throughout, and it sort of bookended with the character. Why did you decide for that structure?
Well, mostly because was the natural grain of what happens, but also because I think it's important to leave you in an emotional place, you, the audience. I think you need to. I mean, there was a debate when we were making the film whether we should have at the end a whole lot of stuff coming up on the screen telling you how many people were killed and who went to prison and when the vote happened and when various things happened politically and historically and all the rest of it. But my feeling was to have none of that, that you should be left in an emotional place, to have your feelings, your sadness, your anger, and to reflect and all those things. And it just seemed a very good way to bring you to that emotionally focused point, really.
When I think of your films, I think of mainly characters. I think of Vera from Vera Drake.
Excuse me, I'm going to stand up for this. I
okay.
can't.
Shall I stand up with you?
No, you don't have
Oh,
to.
okay.
But
I won't. I think of Poppy. I think of Mr. Turner. You know, your films are very much about people. This is slightly different in that you've taken a historical event as the starting point. Yet you have an intimate feel in the film. But was, you know, the epic nature of it, was that something that you have always wanted to do?
No, I mean, you see, so far as I'm concerned, it's epic in the sense that it's obviously big scale because of the nature of the thing. But it is about people, and I don't really feel that it's any different from any of my other films in the sense that, you know, we're looking at people, albeit there's a lot of them, and there's a wide span of who they are. We're still, I hope, I mean, this is not for me to say, but the intention is that we're looking at people in 3 dimensions, real people, and we are looking, however many of them there are, we're looking at them close up, as it were. So in a way, it's only the scale of the story that's different. Obviously, you could also argue that, although I would suggest that all of my films are political in the sense that they're about how we live our lives, obviously this film is in a very particular way more overtly political because it's about matters political, it's about political activity. But in the end, I don't think it's that different from any of its siblings.
No, it isn't, and that I was so drawn into it emotionally. Again, not something I had heard about. I was not taught this in school. Were you taught this in school?
Well, that's the real paradox, because I come from Manchester, where it happened.
Right.
And we, in that area, also hardly knew about it at all. We really, I mean, you could get to where it happened on the bus from where I grew up, from our house, in about 15 minutes. But we really didn't know about it, basically. I mean, we really didn't. And why they didn't, when we were in kids' school, take us down there and march us around and say, this happened and this happened. And they could have had us back in school by lunchtime, and they didn't, you know. No. So it is a paradox, really, and an enigma, and nobody can really explain that.
Right. I think everyone here probably knows about the reputation you have as how you craft your scripts, how you work with your actors. Was that the same way that you worked? And you had so many actors in this film. You can't possibly have sat with them all and worked and rehearsed and create, or did you?
Yes.
You did? I mean, how long did you have for
6 months.
Really?
Yeah, we always have about 6 months before we shoot anything. Yeah. That's what we did. I mean, I wouldn't know how to make a film without doing that. And the script, so-called, we arrived at, in its detail, in the usual way, by scene, sequence by sequence, being on location, improvising, rehearsing, scripting through rehearsal, and arriving at the material and then shooting it. Yeah, it's the same, basically.
And shooting it, seeing as you had, hundreds of extras.
Well, that's when it comes to the actual massacre, which obviously took a fair amount of planning and organisation, and some of it shot with 3 cameras, and a fight director, and trained film horses, and all those things. But in the end, we organised it. It's a great collaboration with a great team of people, but we did it so that, it was still liberated to be organic and spontaneous, in the moment. And of course, all the separate elements with the actors, with the characters, the guys on the hustings, the family on the ground, the other characters on the ground, the magistrates in the house. We developed, rehearsed all those separately, so that they were there to slot into the big scene.
Right. I'm going to open this up to the audience because I'm pretty sure we're going to have lots of questions. Here on the aisle, saw your hand go up first.
Hi, it was a brilliant film, and I would just like to ask you your thoughts. I was very struck by your view, the way you contrasted the different views on Christian morality at that time, how one side thought it was their Christian duty to, affect law and order, and the other side saw Jesus as a reformer, and your use of hymns in the film was really brilliant. I just thought I'd like to hear more about what you thought
from a Christian
going
point
into
of
the
view.
film. Thank you.
The truth is that, I make films about people doing what they do, and that's people, in this case, this is about people doing all sorts of things they do, working, attending political meetings, making speeches. And one of the things that, for example, at the end of the film, there's a funeral scene, which you've just seen, and I've been asked, and I know you're not particularly asking me this, whether there was any religious symbolism in the fact that that is what the last thing you hear in the film is the Lord's Prayer. There is no, from my point of view, as an atheist, there is absolutely no religious significance in that whatever. That is what, at a funeral, that is what they do. They say the Lord's Prayer. The fact is that at that time, some of the radicals, you hear one of the young radicals and indeed the female reformers, they were Christians, and they were pious Christians, and they saw Jesus' journey as being related to their own journey. I personally wouldn't in any way sympathize with their view, but that's irrelevant. That is me asking you to look at them doing what they do. And what they did was express their Christian conviction in the context of their politics.
Right, and a moral conviction. There's a line that these people are our moral inferiors. It's our duty.
Well, that's what one of the magistrates says.
Yeah.
These people are moral inferiors. That's something else again, of course. Yes.
All right. Yes. Sorry, with the glasses.
Hi, I came all the way from South Carolina, so thank you for
put
being
the
here.
microphone near your mouth.
I said I came all the way from South Carolina, so thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
I've only come all the way from the other end of New York.
Well, your first film came out almost 50 years ago, and I wanted to know what has gotten easier and what has gotten harder about making films.
What hasn't got any easier is raising the money to make films. It's quite a hard question to answer, really, because filmmaking is tough anyway. I suppose I would say that having got on top of the skills to some extent, in that sense it becomes easier. But the real point is that we film directors don't make films by ourselves. People that paint pictures, people that write novels, people that write poems and compose music and make sculpture, they operate by themselves. It's a solo existence for those artists. For us, it's collaborative. And you know, I've made a whole bunch of films, including this, leading up to this one, culminating in this one, with a group of people behind the camera and some in front of the camera. And we have a great rapport, and that in itself makes things easier. So in a way, I suppose what was tougher in the early days was us all finding our way and finding each other and learning the skills. But every film feels like the toughest thing you've ever had to do. You know, every film feels like you're really on trial. And, you know, you can't rest on your laurels and things. So I don't really know the answer to your question, which is why I'm now waffling.
You said you work with behind the camera. I mean, obviously, we know you work with actors over and over again because we love those actors. But you also work with behind the scenes people, the cinematographer, for instance, Dick Pope on this.
Yes.
Could you just talk about that? The film looked so gorgeous. Every shot.
Excuse me.
Water.
Some water, please. Dick Pope is a genius, which is a bonus. We've worked together since Life is Sweet in 1990, as you obviously know. And our thing is to push each other, is to push the boundaries. I mean, you know, for a number of years, thank you, could you take the top off me? For a number of years, we had this, thank you, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to take some water now.
Talk amongst yourselves.
For a number of years, we had this notion to make a film about J.M.W. Turner, the painter, which you've seen probably. Now, we absorbed ourselves in Turner. We had Turner coming out of our ears in order to do that. The interesting thing about this film is that some people have said, what painters do you reference in this film? And some people are convinced that we can only have had Vermeer in mind, because when you first see Nellie in her kitchen, she's lit from the left and she's wearing a white cap, and it looks like a Vermeer. The truth is, it never occurred to us while we were shooting it. Not for a split, because we weren't thinking about Vermeer, we were thinking about what it was about. We were thinking about Manchester at the beginning of the 19th century. So there aren't any real, in this film, there aren't any real conscious references to any particular painters, except that when you see the Prince Regent and his mistress right at the end of the film, we did take for our reference the caricatures of Gilray and Rowlandson, the great Regency caricaturists, who really relentlessly and viciously drew the Prince Regent, the fat Prince Regent and his mistress, and that did inform the way we depict them in that scene, basically. But
look at the hands go up.
But from a cinematographic point of view, from a photographic point of view, I mean, Dick Pope just is fantastic at creating, painting with light. You know.
It's gorgeous. I'm going to go for the man at the back because I never do the back.
Thank you. I was especially intrigued by the outlier in the mass movement, the agent provocateur. How much was his character drawn from the historical record, and where did you come up with him and what he did?
Oliver the Spy was one of the more famous of many spies that they had. I mean, the government was relentless in its use of spies. I mean, they were all over the place. The place was crawling with them. Oliver the Spy, I mean, it's what I put in the film is a very, very distilled and restricted picture of what that particular scurrilous guy got up to. I mean, it was outrageous. And these guys were like all spies, really. They were shameless in the way that they manipulated people. So it's drawn directly from what actually happened, and we just tried to breathe life into him, really.
Here at the front.
I was intrigued about the character of Henry Hunt, and how much you interpret what you knew about him, and how much you tried to distill, and also how much you worked with the actor to get that portrayal, because of the many characters that are in this film, this is one real one that you could draw on, as opposed to the ones that you supposed were there.
Did everyone hear that question? It was about Henry Hunt, who, we know was a real orator. How much did you
Draw on the real.
Yeah,
did
yeah.
you draw on the real character?
You and the actor developed.
Well, first of all, we of course, researched completely what the guy was actually like, and there is no question. He was a rich landowner. He was a committed radical. He espoused the cause. He was would seem a brilliant orator. He had a very loud voice. But it's also obvious he was a massive egocentric, a narcissist of the first order, profoundly arrogant, and he's not somebody I would want to spend too much time with, really. And what we did, Rory Kinnear and I, and we've done this with, I mean, there are quite a lot of characters in the film that did actually exist. And what we did is, and what we've done there, as indeed we did with Turner and indeed with Gilbert and Sullivan and those characters in Topsy Turvy, is to try and dramatise them as we understood them. And with a character as outrageous as orator Hunt, as Henry Hunt, you don't need to add too much more, really. I mean, because he is pretty outrageous. That's all I can tell you.
And the character of Joseph was based on someone who was at Waterloo
No,
and then
I mean,
died.
but that's not quite the same thing. I mean, there were veterans of Waterloo at Peterloo, and there was one particular guy who was called John Leigh from Oldham, who was injured at Peterloo and died 2 weeks later, and he became particularly well known after his death because there was an inquest held. And the evidence that started to come out of the inquest was so incriminating for the authorities that the authorities stopped the inquest, and that became notorious. Now, I took that as a jumping off point. Joseph is no way a portrait of that guy, but that really was the sort of, that kick-started my idea that you'd see somebody who was at Waterloo and who would die at Peterloo, and that's where that came from.
Let's hear from a female in the audience. Yes.
Hold on. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, you do such an excellent job of portraying this hidden part of history that no one knew ever took place. But what happened after you mentioned the inquest? Was there any repercussion? We see the journalists fly about, but then it's sort of just like, there's also this emotion that you capture that no matter what happens, these people suffer at the hands of these elites that are just, there's no sense of justice. So what were your thoughts on that as you were making this film?
What you're really asking me is what happened, basically.
Yeah.
And what I said earlier was that I definitely decided not to put those things up at the end of the film, but I'm here to tell you if you want to know. I mean, first of all, one of the interesting things is that the Times reporter, Tyus, who is portrayed in the film, did go back to London, and although the Times was, as indeed it remains, a conservative newspaper, they reported it absolutely accurately, and not all the newspapers did. Some of the newspapers were published lies and blamed the crowds and all of that. But the story got out, and it became pretty quickly a cause célèbre, and people were absolutely horrified as to what had happened. The government, the Tory government of the time, which is generally regarded historically as being the most repressive government ever in England, introduced 6 acts of parliament which, restricted freedom of the press, freedom of association, etc. And so that happened. And of course, people went to prison. Hunt went to prison for 2 years. Other people went to prison. And indeed, it took from 1819 till 1832 before there was any legislation that changed the fact that only 2% of the people could vote. And it took till 1873 until the vote really expanded. And of course, it was not till 1918 that women got the vote, and that wasn't all of them. They didn't finally. There wasn't universal franchise till 1923. So.
I mean, no, obviously I know the answer to this. It doesn't surprise me. I can't imagine it surprises you that this event sort of has been brushed over, because I still feel like the topical parallels to this, we're still seeing peaceful protests that end in violence. We talk about it immensely for a while, and then, you know, it's like Ferguson, it sort of fades, you know, people move on. Do you see your film as being very topical still?
Well, yes, it isn't. I feel that it's not for me to say, but it seems obvious to me. I mean, we started to prepare the film at the beginning of 2014. Just as soon as we started to do so, we found ourselves almost on a daily basis saying, actually, this is kind of relevant, isn't it? What we didn't and couldn't have anticipated in 2014 is how much the world was going to change in half a decade, because some pretty cataclysmic events took place in 2016. One of them happened in this country, and you know what that was. Another one happened in the UK, and that is totally disastrous and is tearing apart the UK. I mean, the interesting thing about what we've put in the film, I think, is that is the matter of the French Revolution, which had only happened a few years previously, which inspired the radicals and terrified the authorities, not least the royal family, who were worried that there would be an English revolution. Well, we know there hasn't been an English revolution, but stay tuned, folks, any day now, I would say.
And you'll be leading it. I think we have time for one more question. Over here, I haven't done anything from this side. Sorry, behind you.
Hello, thank you so much for a beautiful film.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the comedy in the film. I think there are certain comic elements where no character is really above reproach or irony, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, sometimes over the years, people have said to me, when do you decide when to put in humor and when not? And the fact is, I don't, and I think this relates to your question. You know, I'm in the business of putting on the screen people like we are, real people, in a real way. And we are comic and tragic. Life is comic and tragic, whether you don't have to do anything about it. It just comes out of the seam like that. You know, how many people can claim to have been to a funeral and not found something funny? And worse than that, how many people can claim to have been to a wedding and not thought it was tragic? Yeah. And on that note, thank you very much indeed, and good night.
Everyone, come back, see the film again, tell your friends, tell everyone to go see it. Mike Leigh, thank you so much.